the words we just sang then, I think if the Apostle Paul was sitting here right now, he'd be going, yes, that song gets it. Why? Because that line, "You're alive in us," what greater truth is there than that as we talk about transformation, as we talk about not being conformed to the pattern of this world? That is the big deal, that Christ says, "I want to dwell richly in you." John 15 says, "As you abide in me, I in you, I will work through you and produce great fruits." He is alive in us. Do you know what? I also like that song for another reason, because there's so many songs that concentrate on me and I, which is not a bad thing, but me and I, that one, "Alive in us," nothing can take your place, you're all we need. The lines of that song, I hadn't heard that song until this camp, and now it's like that. Those words over and over, you can't help but think, what about if he was all we need? What about if he was alive in us? That is the big deal we're trying to talk about this week. That he is all we need. At home, on our fridge, we've got one of those magnetic AFL ladders. And one of the good things about shifting from Sydney to Melbourne is that you get just stacks of AFL. And one night, Amanda and I are sitting there watching the telly. You know how they give that news update? And it wasn't the sports news, it was the actual news update. And the first 3 stories were all AFL stories. There was no more stories. It just said, "Have a good evening." And I'm thinking, there's a world out there where people are dropping bombs and there's terrorists and all this stuff going on everywhere. 30,000 children starving. Now, that's all bad stuff. But in Melbourne, the top 3 stories, the only 3 stories in the news update were AFL. Isn't it great? So on our fridge, we've got the AFL ladder. Now, we don't actually arrange it in order of the real AFL ladder, although if you checked the AFL ladder last night, we would have arranged it that order, because for a brief moment, Richmond were on top because it was the only game played so far this season. But we arrange it in our favourite to worst club. And so Richmond obviously are on top, and Western Bulldogs are on the bottom, and everyone fits in somewhere in between. We've got all arranged, and there it is. Life can be a little bit like the AFL ladder, hey? Because sometimes, and I can see why we say it, and there's verses in the Bible to support it, we say put God first. And then we say, what do we put second? You might say, well, we'll put God first, we'll put others second, and then that's where my job fits in, or that's where my school, uni stuff fits in, and that's where my church fits in. And we make all these rungs on the ladder. And we say, put God first. But there's a problem with that. Because when we say put God first, and of course we should put God first, and I can understand when Barbara Wright is saying put God first, but there's a bigger concept going on, and it's the concept that Paul says. When we put God first, then we're tempted to go, well, there's something else second, and there's something else third, and there's something else fourth and fifth, where reality is, in this analogy, God's not first, God's the whole AFL. God is the game. So it's not as if we're putting God one of the teams. He's the whole thing. So when it comes to life, God is the whole game. The whole thing is from God and is God. And whether it's your job, whether it's your schoolwork, whether it's your family, whether it's your serving in your church, whether it's some other thing you're involved in, whether it's your hobby, whatever it is, sure, at that particular time, at that particular moment, it might be first. But always remember, it's only part of the big game. And what's the big game? The game is God. We are alive in Him. He is all we need. And from start to finish, the whole game is everything is about God, from God, for His glory. And so when we're doing our ordinary everyday life, if that's going to school, then the game is still God. As Eugene Peterson paraphrases Paul's writing a message, in your ordinary everyday life, you're eating, you're sleeping, you're going to work, and walking around life. All of it belongs to God. He says, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice in all of it. So it's not some other rung on the ladder. God is not something to put first. He's something to put at the center. When it's at the center, everything else radiates out of that. So with God at the center, that changes how I view who I am, and that changes how I view who one another is. That changes how I go about my purchasing. That means in your ordinary everyday life, you're eating, you're sleeping, you're going to school, you're walking around, going to the shops life. That when I do my shopping, it's a spiritual thing. Everything is spiritual. Reality is, we often divide life into different compartments. Excuse me, it's got a bit of a frog in my throat. We divide life into different compartments where we say, this is my physical. What's the next part? Emotional, mental, social, and spiritual. We get the idea from a Greek concept of the gods, where we have different compartments of life. Now, sure, we do experience life through different spheres. And sure, we do have different ways that we experience and go about doing life. But often, and you see it often in mission statements for the preschools and things, we're going to develop the child socially, emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. Is there a problem with that? What's the problem? Not just the spiritually at the end, that is a problem. But if you put spiritually first, the problem is in Paul's thinking, and this is what he's trying to address when he writes Romans 12. The problem is in Paul's thinking, your physical life is your spiritual life. Your social life is your spiritual life. Your emotional life is your spiritual life. Your mental life is your spiritual life. In Paul's thinking, all of it, absolutely all of it, is spiritual. Spirituality is not a separate compartment. It's not that, well, now we're going to do our spiritual thing, but now I'm doing my social thing. No, Paul's saying that's not the point. The way you go about social, the way you interact with your friends, the entertainment you choose, and the way you go about treating other people is spiritual. Or that's my spiritual life, and this is my emotional life. Now, Paul's saying, no, the way you guard who you are, or this is my mental life, what you feed your mind. He's saying the whole thing is spiritual. Spirituality is simply your life from God's perspective. All of your life. The game is God, and all of life is spiritual. So that means when it comes to making decisions about your purchases, or when it comes to making decisions about how you treat others, or when it comes to... Thank you. We've got all sorts of things going on here. Thank you. So when it comes to making decisions, we filter all of that through the fact that everything is spiritual. The decision from how you're going to spend your income, which is God's anyway. The decision for how you're going to go about your purchases, which is all about God anyway. It's all spiritual. And often we forget that. Often we think spirituality is my prayer time and worship time, and it's heart-building habits is important. I'm not saying they're not. But often we think spirituality is Sabbath, or spirituality is these CDs but not those ones. Spirituality is this but not that. And we forget that the way we go about all of life, now as Adventists theoretically we believe this, we say we're holistic beings, and we say that the way we go about our health, the way we go about our entertainment, the way we go about treating one another, we say all of it is spiritual, and it is. So when it comes to addressing consumerism, this whole consumer deal, it's worth remembering that all your choices are spiritual. Now, the verse Ephesians 4, 22, 23, which we've been talking about, and this whole idea of reclaim and reclaiming identity in Christ and this renewing of your mind and living this new life, just after Paul wrote that bit, he then wrote a whole section on living as children of light. And he writes one of the best tips, I think, for this whole spiritual life. He asks the best question ever. What's the best question ever? Well, this is not the most important question ever. The most important question ever is when God says, "What have you done with my son?" But I think the question that Paul asks in Ephesians 5:15, is the best question ever. Why? Because the question he puts in here is a grid you can filter all your decisions through. Because sometimes we get caught using the wrong grid. We can end up asking, is this right or is this wrong? And sometimes when we ask the is this right or is this wrong question, we can end up playing silly little games and thinking, well, it's not really wrong, so it must be right. Or we end up playing silly little games where we go, well, I can go this close to wrong and stay on the right side of it. Or we end up justifying things and we make up all sorts of little excuses in our head thinking, well, we know it's a wrong answer, but what about if we take it from that angle? And we play these silly little is this wrong, is this right games. I don't think that's the grid. And Paul says that's not the grid. When it comes to evaluating your decisions, whether that be your decisions on your purchases, whether that be decisions about what you're doing with your life, whether that be decisions about how you're treating other people, whether that be decisions about how you're going to use or what role sex plays in your life, all these decisions, and that Paul actually in Ephesians 5 points out those very topics I just mentioned, by the way. And he says all these decisions come back to the best question ever. Because you and I are good at justifying things, and we think if there's not a thou shalt not, then maybe it means it's okay. But the best question ever, and the question I want to leave you with tonight, and the question I want your grid to be as you filter these decisions, and the question as you think about how you live life and not as commodity, the question that Paul asks in Ephesians 5:15, the question that he says, if you're really going to live this new transformed life, if you're really not going to be conformed to the patterns of this world, if you are going to be transformed by renewing your mind, he says, here's the question. Do you want to know the question? Well, if I can make my little thing click, we've gone too far. It's simple. Paul says in Ephesians 5:15, he says, don't live in darkness. He says, you're called to be someone new. He says, be transformed. And he says, live as wise. He says, ask, is this wise? It's the best question ever because you can apply that in any situation. You can apply that in any environment. You can apply that to your purchases. Is this wise? Not is this right, is this wrong? Is this wise? And that can be in light of a whole lot of things. Is this a wise purchase in view of what it's going to do environmentally? Sometimes as Christians, we need to ensure that we do take responsibility for stewarding creation, which God asks us to do. And sometimes our purchases aren't wise in that light. Sometimes things we purchase, it's not wrong. It's just not wise. It's just not being a wise steward of creation. And reality is in our consumer society, if the whole planet consumed at the rate that our Western cultures do, then the planet's not sustainable for very many days at all. The way we dig everything up and the way we use our planet to supply and resource our commodified lifestyle isn't a sustainable lifestyle. And so as we're making our purchases, as we're consuming, sometimes it's worth asking, is this a wise purchase? Or is this wise on another scale? Because sometimes our purchases along the chain, all sorts of people are involved or not involved. And we no longer know the story of our stuff. And we've exploited people along that chain. Now, I'm not saying to get obsessed with this, but what I am saying is think about it. Think about how our purchases as Christians, how us being consumers should impact this planet in positive ways. We can make choices that give more dignity. Once upon a time, when we lived in our villages, we knew the story of our stuff. And so if I was buying a chair, then that man down the road made chairs, and his dad had made chairs before him. And he didn't have to advertise his chairs because he was the only chair maker there. And he charged a fair price. And he charged a fair price because if he didn't charge a fair price, the whole community knew who he was, and he would lose his esteem in the community because everyone knew he was ripping us off. And so he'd charge a fair price for his chair. And so I'd go and get my chair from him, and that's the story of my chair. And when I sat on my chair, I'd know the story of my chair. Or whether it be my clothes, I would know the story of my clothes. I would know what is involved in making my clothes, whether it was the leather or the cotton, whatever. I'd know that this person here was able to weave, and this person here had the loom, and this person here was going to do a fair price, and I was going to pay fairly for that because they were going to pay fairly for what I was doing, and I would know the story of what I was wearing. Along comes the Industrial Revolution, and we get the ability to produce on a really big scale. And we get to the ability to become part of the production process. And so all of a sudden, we could get these people, and no longer are they part of this village. They're congregating in these big cities where we've got these big factories. And now they have become a commodifiable piece of the production unit. And now they are a piece of a bottom line saying, this is the production cost to produce this chair. And you produce that bit of the chair, and you produce that bit of the chair, and here's the chair. And I walk into IKEA and buy the chair. And I don't know who made the chair or where it got made or how it got made. And I no longer know the story of my stuff. It's worth sometimes rethinking and working out, how did this get here? Sadly, when we don't know the story of stuff, we also don't appreciate that stuff. We don't put the same value on that stuff. And you drive around in the suburb of Lilydale. It's a really interesting thing they do. I guess they do it all around Melbourne. I don't know. They don't play this game in Sydney, where they do hard rubbish collection or this inorganic waste. And all of a sudden, the whole place looks like a dump for a few weeks. And as Amanda and I are doing our walk around the suburb, in Sydney, you have to ring up the council and they put out that morning and collect it that day. But in Lilydale, you just put it out, seems like days and weeks before, and everyone has this big junk sale and people transfer your rubbish for someone else's rubbish. And it seems like everyone's throwing out a barbecue and everyone's throwing out a big fat telly. And you look on all these junk piles and it's just like, what's going on? And there's all sorts of stuff. Now, I'm not saying keep your stuff. But I am saying, let's think about how we go about using our stuff, and if we really needed to start with, and what's the story of those things? Because there was a time when we didn't throw out so much because we didn't have so much. We live in a disposable society, sure, but think about, what are we even disposing? And think about the story of what we have. As environmental stewards, you might think, my bit doesn't make a difference, but guess what? It does. Because my bit is an important bit, because if I don't care, and if someone else doesn't care, and if someone else doesn't care, then no one cares. If one person cares, and another person cares, and another person cares, then there's a few people who care. And regardless, God calls you to be a steward of his environment. And the way we go about consuming, the way we go about treating commodities is a part of being spiritual. So it's worth thinking, this whole consumer grid. What do I actually need this? How am I going to use this? Or is there a way I can use this to bless others? And if I don't need that, reality is we have more stuff than ever. And in the parable of Luke chapter 12, that rich man who dies, Jesus says, someone's going to get your stuff anyway. Either you're going to be generous with it before you die, or you're going to be a stingy person and they're going to get it when you die anyway. And would you rather be a generous person who gave it away before you're dead, or would you rather be a stingy person who died having won the game of Monopoly, but everyone takes all your stuff? Most of us are living life like that game of Monopoly, where it goes round and round and round. And on a rainy day in Mildura, which wasn't too often, but when it was, my brothers and I would be playing Monopoly. And there'll be times when I was doing really well. And there's times when I would start owning Mayfair and Park Lane. And there's times when my oldest brother would get out of the game because I owned the whole thing. And my sister would get out of the game because I bought her stuff. And my brother would get out of the game because he lent on my square and took his money. And my next brother and my little brother, all gone. And I owned the whole world. But you know what happens next? My mum would say, put it all back in the box now. And reality is, there's going to come a time, if Jesus doesn't come first, you're going to be put in the box. And all the stuff you accumulated won't seem so important then. Reality is, we get addicted to our stuff. Do you know that the self-storage industry, which didn't exist even 20 years ago, is now worth more than the music industry? because we've got all our stuff in our houses, and we have bigger houses with more and more empty rooms, by the way, while there's homeless people all over the show. But we have all these houses with bigger stuff, and we fill all that stuff, and then we fill our garages, and our wives tell us to clean out our garages because they want to put the car in there, and so we go and get a self-storage and put more stuff there, and we're not going to use all that stuff. And then someone, when we die, someone's going to sort through our stuff and work out which part of our stuff they're going to put with their stuff. And in the whole process, all this stuff goes everywhere, end up stuffed. Amongst all this, with all this stuff, we think, well, I'm going to be happy because I have to keep all this stuff. And we've lived this lie, this thing that we've talked about the last few nights, this time equals money, things equals happiness. And we think, well, we should be the happiest people in the history of the planet because we have more stuff than ever. Egyptian pharaohs would look at all your stuff and go, wow, they are really rich. Are we happier for all our stuff? Well, we're actually more depressed than the generation of people that lived through the Great Depression. It's not delivering. So amongst all that grid, Paul would say, pull back and ask the best question ever. He would say, is this wise? Apply wisdom to your purchases, apply wisdom to your relationships, apply wisdom to your life choices. He would say, apply wisdom to everything. Absolutely everything, Paul says. Every decision, Paul says, is a spiritual decision. And we might not think that, but God says, I'm interested in all your life. I want to do all life with you, your ordinary, everyday life. Because I want to walk with you. I want to eat with you. I want to do the ordinary, everyday things with you. That means all your decisions are important. Now, we don't think all the time that this is a spiritual decision. But reality is, all of life, all of your choices, your purchases, the way you go about it, your life is simply spiritual. All of your life is spiritual from God's perspective. And so tonight, the only thing I want you to really remember is this wise question? And next time when you're doing your shopping thing, your commodity thing, next time you're thinking, how am I treating my girlfriend, my boyfriend? How am I treating my husband, my wife? How am I treating other people? Do I turn them in commodity? Next time you're thinking about, how am I using my money? That's in actual fact, how am I using God's money? Because it all belongs to Him anyway. Then do ask the question, is this wise? Where does wisdom start from? There's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom, by the way. You can get some very knowledgeable people who are very unwise. Wisdom, it says, well, Paul gives the answer. Once again, the answer's in James. It's also in Proverbs. It says wisdom starts with God. It says, ask God for wisdom. Well, Paul says, God will dwell in you. You're alive in me. Nothing can take your place. You're all I need. And with that, Paul says, that's the beginning of wisdom. It says, invite God into life, all of your life, every part of life, and you live life from His perspective. As we finish off tonight, there's a couple of songs, one of them talking about worship and being a worshipful person and coming back to this heart of worship, and it is all about Him. Both songs are talking about life from God's perspective and what it means to live as His child. Because in the end, we're alive in Him. That's all we need. Nothing can take His place. Imagine if that was true.